You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting, from Mary Oliver's The Wild Geese. Ethics generally addresses the question of what we ought to count as good behavior and what sort of moral principles we should rely on when making decisions. It provides us with an understanding of what makes us good and what constitutes a good life. Ethical thought typically is guided by certain assumptions about the human condition. Normally, when we call to mind the classical tradition in ethics, we usually think of the philosophical works of Aristotle, such as his Nicomachean Ethics, which promotes the idea that it is not sufficient merely to know what good is. One has to become good in order to possess good character and live a good life. We see iterations of this idea. In the ideas handed down to us by other Greek philosophers, for example, Socrates, Plato, Epicurus, Epictetus, and Cicero. The tradition is also reflected in Eastern wisdom of Confucius and Mencius. Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam also offer significant moral guidance, often at the direction of a divine hand, about practicing goodness in addition to attempting to answer some of the larger questions about life and the universe. Early liberal approaches to ethics, however, for the most part, dispensed with the classical tradition and its reliance on divine commandment. The emphasis of moral reasoning, especially since the European Enlightenment, has largely been on doing the right thing rather than on being good. These approaches depend mostly on systematic examination of principles guiding people's actions. Identifying rigorous justifications for decision-making, therefore, ought to provide us with credible responses to any situation. 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant most often comes to mind as embodying that tradition. According to philosopher Richard Rorty, when Kant and other Enlightenment thinkers detached moral obligations from divine commands, they did not think they were revising our moral concepts, but that they were describing them more clearly. They were helping us to clarify our conception of morality. Kant broke with the deterministic tradition, which was common currency in antiquity, especially among such Greek philosophers as Leucippus and Democritus. Determinism contends that all events in the universe remain linked in a predictable, unbroken chain. Determinists think free will is largely an illusion. Kant poses a radically new question. Is it conceivable we can be part of a determined reality yet possess free will? Kant believes we have an obligation to do what is right without reliance upon moral agency or concern for the consequences of our actions. The efficacy of this deontological or duty-based approach to moral reasoning is measured not by the results it produces, but rather by how well it conforms to the implicit nature of identifiable moral principles that surface from our reasoning about those principles. Kant rationalizes the implicitness of moral principles by observing whether any one principle can be justified by its universality and consistency, the so-called categorical imperative. Utilitarian thinking, another product of the Enlightenment, cares about whether what we do can generate the most good for the most number of people. Within a utilitarian framework, an ethical principle is not justifiable by its universality, but by whether behaviors associated with that principle foster morally satisfactory outcomes. In other words, whether the outcomes serve the greater good. As such, an ethical principle cannot be applied consistently to every situation within all conceivable contexts. Because situations and contexts vary widely, it can be argued an ethical principle at best can only serve as a sort of normative guideline. Further, utilitarian ethicists such as John Stuart Mills place considerable emphasis on individual rights and liberties. Under Mills's system of ethics, I would generally want all people to be treated the same way that I expect to be treated. Mills makes a case for a formal system of ethics based on dependable formulas of moral reasoning. Decision-making in a formalist system, for example, focuses mostly on the consequences of the act, less so on the person committing an act, and even less on the motives of an act. A utilitarian model consequently leads us toward concepts of fairness, in which everyone, regardless of their social status, personal circumstances, or any other perceived difference, should all be treated in a just and impartial manner. And justice is at the heart of John Rawls's comprehensive philosophical doctrine, as it has been called. Rawls's work, considered by many to epitomize 20th century ethical thought, holds, in the words of theologian Kristen D. Johnson, that if all people accepted their duty to exercise reason, then all could be united around a body of moral truths to which reason has led them that would serve as the basis for public life. More recently, a number of postmodern ethical thinkers generally have found neither value in classical approaches, nor have they put much stock in our ability to formulate a systematic approach to solving moral problems. More conciliatory thinkers today contend that principles alone are inadequate for moral reasoning, and that an appreciation for the good also is necessary for making sound moral decisions. Current conceptualizations of ethics seek to blend arguments in support of a certain way of life, favorite types of behavior, and principles for moral reasoning. Ethics, as imagined today, embraces both normative and empirical positions. Empirical reasoning aims to establish a true and logical characterization of moral ideas in order to convey a propositional understanding of the ethical universe, much like scientific theories attempt to achieve with respect to the physical world. Normative assertions, on the other hand, deal with concepts about what is good and focus on how we ought to behave. Further, philosophers, especially since the infusion of sociology, anthropology, and psychology into the scientific canon, have increasingly become concerned with the motivations behind doing the right thing and the reasons why people conform or deviate from social norms. The social sciences thus recognize three ethical motivators: emotional or affective reasoning, a sense of duty, and concern for the consequences of one's action. Yet, from an ethicist's point of view, merely surmising what might cause people to adhere to certain norms is insufficient for shaping an understanding of which norms are the right ones to follow. How do we determine whether our actions will conform to certain ethical principles? Motivations, norms, and principles, however, are not the only concern of present-day examination of ethics. That examination also invites us to consider the question of what constitutes good character and the good life. Aristotle and other classic philosophers contend that good actions stem from the exercise of virtuous behavior, which in turn fosters the overall good of the community. Virtues, therefore, are the means through which we accrue the benefits of a good life for ourselves as individuals and for our communities. Thus, ethics argues for an integral relationship between our sense of self and the communities we inhabit. In other words, the individual good is bound up in the common good. Yet, as we are well aware just from glancing at the day's headlines, acting virtuously with any reliability does not appear to be humanity's strong suit. In the Laws, Plato writes, "Men earnestly bent on becoming thoroughly good, and that with all speed, are not easily to be found, nor in large numbers." Noting the road to virtue can be traveled without sweat, Plato, citing Hesiod, pronounces, "The path to vice is smooth, and before virtue the immortal gods have set sweat." Thomas Hobbes understands virtues to be abilities of the mind. Thus, to be truly authentic, virtue must be seen as more than just a set of techniques that allow us to get by. As ethicist Stuart Brody contends, this explains why for many of us relationships seem utilitarian, our workplaces are venues for pursuing gain without accountability, and our nation's politics remains dysfunctional. Our belief in what is right tends to become colored by illusions of moral competence, that's Brody's coinage, that deviate us from our intentions to do good. Like illusions in general, they represent distortions of reality engendered by the ways we habitually think and speak about things. Overconfident in our capacity to act virtuously, and convinced that integrity, for example, is something we can have, we risk misleading ourselves about our own decision-making behavior. How, therefore, shall we know the difference between impulse and judicious insight, and by extension, gain access to a thoughtful understanding of ourselves in the world? Ethical problem solving at its core appears to be a way we try to make sense of our environment, our actions, and the behavior of others. We are in one way or another, and to varying degrees directly and indirectly affected by our environment, our own actions, and the behavior of other people. Our motivation to resolve an ethical problem tends to be gauged by our expectations of the personal or communal consequences of that problem. Practically speaking, we attempt to make the best of situations while trying to minimize the negative outcomes. When things appear to be going well, we rarely seek to alter our environment, our own actions, and the actions of others. However, when we encounter stumbling blocks impeding the attainment of our goals, we might look for ways to alter our environment, our actions, and the behavior of others. Aristotle conjectures that the goal of a fulfilling life is some sort of good, a presumption rooted in the idea that all activities converge on the good. As a practical matter, though, some of what we do seems to be behavior for its own sake, fundamentally pragmatic. In our ethical thinking, we tend to believe certain behaviors will lead to more efficacious outcomes than others. We favor or prescribe particular behaviors and disparage or proscribe other behaviors. Thus, the practical nature of ethics precedes the normative, not the other way around. Yet ethics most often emerges as inherently normative because that is generally the way we talk about ethics, in a rationalized post hoc manner. Korzybski is emphatic about the need to make allowances for the emotional component in intellectual activity. He argues that emotion colors our thinking and has discernible semantic consequences. We must seriously consider the powerful structural effect emotional energy has upon our behavior. Moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt argues that much of what we interpret as ethical reasoning is in reality strongly influenced by our affective state. Therefore, it is not surprising that our most profound ethical inclinations often take the form of mere hunches or feelings, and we tend to ascribe such moral presentiments to intuition, which afterward we work out in a rationalized and coherent linguistic utterances, to paraphrase Korzybski. Haidt explains that only later do we offer theories about the motives for our behavior with post hoc justifications. For example, when we do something we know is wrong, we typically seek reasons why we felt compelled to behave that way. We nurse theories that blame situations for our actions rather than looking to faults in our own character, a phenomenon psychologists label fundamental attribution error. Korzybski classifies ethics as one of several forms of adjustment to neurological mechanisms. Indeed, recent neurological research seems to confirm Korzybski's notion that abstracting represents structurally and semantically the activities characteristic of the nervous system. Recent studies carried out by a team of MIT scientists postulate that statistical regularities in the environment create prior beliefs that we rely on to optimize our behavior when sensory information is uncertain. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson explains it this way: some of the rules governing behavior are well understood, while we have only partial information for other rules. It is toward these implicit, poorly understood rules that the MIT scientists appear to be directing their attention. Relying on Bayesian theory, the group has been looking at the effect of statistical regularities of behavior in order to understand the combined effect of prior beliefs and sensory evidence in perception. Simply put, Bayesian inference theorizes that probability of an event contingent upon prior knowledge of conditions likely related to the event. Different inferences concerning a probability can manifest themselves as additional knowledge becomes available. The researchers contend past experiences impress upon neural circuits information about statistical regularities in the environment, which in turn help us to behave in certain ways. The MIT team thus is trying to identify innate systematic structures, an invisible spell, to use Nietzsche's term, in which behavior exploits statistical regularities in relation to how the nervous system represents past experience. As behaviors have become imitated, transmitted, and mythologized within cultures and normalized over time through time binding, human experience has had to wrestle with fundamental questions of what is right and wrong, definitions of moral versus immoral, and the meaning of good and evil. The concept of sin is one way societies have accounted for bad behavior. Sinfulness, to paraphrase Hannah Arendt, is humanity's great equalizer. In Christian interpretation, sinfulness has been inherent in the human condition ever since Eve and Adam ate of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, Christian doctrine consistently equated human nature with original sin. But let us suppose bad actions were not just natural to us, but in some way normative. What if, as British novelist Russell Hoban conjectures, God did not make the fruit in the Garden of Eden resistible? It had to be eaten. God made us such that we would eat of that fruit. God would have been ashamed of us if we hadn't done it. Aristotle believed morality is centered on progress toward the good. Our actions ought therefore to be intentionally good, arising from a desire to do something worthwhile, something virtuous. But imagine the contrary, as occurred in Eden. Just because we perceive an action to be bad is not sufficient reason to desist from it Moreover, imagine that we would in fact take an action for what we believe to be what Israeli philosopher Yosef Raz calls a defeated reason. In other words, defeated by considerations that establish that the action should not be done. Raz refers to this thesis as the guise of the bad. Put succinctly, this thesis asks whether it is possible to believe that the bad features of an action are reasons to take it. The thesis also raises the question of whether actions taken in belief that they are bad are susceptible to normative explanations. Raz contends that bad actions taken repeatedly for no other reason than they are bad implies such actions can be considered morally normative. What's been happening in the White House might lend itself convincingly to such a just saying. If this thesis is true, then, Raz inquires, how can one choose an action for the reason that it is bad? Kant, of course, would have argued there are actions that are the right thing to do, actions that consist of doing our duty, and actions that we morally must carry out. However, such behavior amounts mostly to exhibiting ethical properties. They do not, in and of themselves, constitute goodness. Conceivably, therefore, we could believe we are doing the right thing, doing our duty, and committing morally just acts, and this is, makes me think about our speaker's comments last night, believing there is some good in them. But Raz notes that we can act intentionally because of a belief that the action is bad in some respect. What makes a bad action worth doing? Self-deception certainly can be a reason, a belief that the bad we are doing is actually good. Irrationality also can serve as a reason, a person's inability to discern good from bad due to impairment or environmental circumstances. In both instances, such behavior eludes normative explanation. I'm reminded of the sequence of events in William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Concluding. Okay. When the boys first are marooned on the island, their behavior is still constrained by rules and law. The specter of society's protection still hovers about the children. An initial turning point comes when, unhindered by parental restrictions, the boys do virtually nothing but play games for hours on end soon after their arrival. Their nighttime dreams, however, haunted by a terrible beast, foreshadow something savage. The appearance of the dead airman plunges the boys into panic and quickly untethers them from whatever little moral control the former adult world still exerts upon their behavior. Fear mounts, anarchy ensues, and one of the boys, Simon, is murdered in the process. With the complete destruction of rule and order, the boys descend into evil and cannot even retain further memory of their earlier experiences in paradise. The boys have laid waste to the island, which has become nothing but a scorched remnant of the original paradise. The arrival of the naval rescue party onto the scene at the close of the novel shocks us back into some sense of ordinariness and sanity. Yet we cannot be sure of how the boys' story will proceed beyond the book's culmination, now that they have elected to embrace darkness. Lord of the Flies is a tragic fable, a contrived fiction comfortably and conveniently about children, but nonetheless a tale with valuable insights into ways we norm the bad. The Guise of the bad thesis, to reiterate, proposes that people may take action for the reasons against taking the action. This is not accidental behavior, Raz notes. Someone acting for the bad makes no mistake about the character of his action. In this manner, acting for the bad can be seen as normative. One is acting for a reason, but without anything assumed to be good about the action being one's reason, and essentially ignoring whether the action is worthwhile. Thank you.